Take a good look at her. Our brother could have married anyone, but he chose this? A broke nobody?
Everyone thought I was just a broke nobody who got lucky marrying Wallace Harmon. Even his own brothers treated me like a stain on their family name. But when armed men stormed our wedding, they discovered something about me that shocked everyone, including the man I was supposed to marry. Before I tell you how my wedding day became a war zone, tell me, where are you watching this from? I love finding out where you all my family are. Also, make sure to hit subscribe and ring that bell. This story has twists that'll leave you speechless. Trust me, billion-dollar empires have been built on smaller secrets than mine. My name is Amber Chase, and 1 year ago, I was living the quietest life imaginable in Chicago. I worked at a small humanitarian foundation tucked between coffee shops and bookstores, coordinating community projects that nobody celebrated but everybody needed. Every morning I'd tie my hair in a simple bun, wear clothes from thrift stores, and disappear into paperwork. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me peace after everything I'd survived. That October evening changed everything. A black Mercedes pulled up to the foundation's tiny office just as I was locking up. Out stepped the most charming man I'd ever seen, tall, warm brown eyes, wearing a tailored suit that whispered old money. He looked completely out of place in my humble workspace, like a prince who'd stumbled into the wrong kingdom. "Excuse me, I'm looking for someone who works here. Amber Chase?" His voice was gentle, uncertain. I wiped my hands on my worn cardigan and smiled. "That's me. How can I help you?" He seemed surprised, maybe because I looked more like a volunteer than someone running programs. "I'm Wallace Harmon. My family donates to this foundation, and I wanted to see the work firsthand instead of just signing checks." One conversation told me everything. Wallace wasn't like the other wealthy donors who treated charity like a tax write-off. He actually listened when I explained how we'd rebuilt 3 community centers with grants nobody else would approve. He asked questions about the families we served, the projects we'd launched, the dreams we were fighting to keep alive. While I showed him around our cramped office, we talked. He was fascinated by my passion for invisible work, asking why I chose this path when I clearly had the intelligence for something more prestigious. Most wealthy people treated me like I was naive, but Wallace seemed genuinely moved by what I had to say. When the tour ended, he lingered at the door. "Would you maybe like to get dinner sometime? Not as a donor, just as someone who'd like to know you better." I almost laughed. This man in his expensive suit asking out a foundation worker who couldn't even afford new shoes. But something in his eyes seemed sincere, almost vulnerable. "Sure," I heard myself say. That dinner turned into long walks through Grant Park, late-night conversations about justice and legacy, and Sunday mornings where he'd show up with coffee while I organized donation drives. Wallace told me he was heir to the Harmon fortune, part of Chicago's elite social circles, drowning in expectations. I told him about my work, my love for helping forgotten communities, and my quiet life away from attention. What I didn't tell him was why I'd chosen such an invisible existence, or who had trained me to build empires before I learned to hide from them. 4 months later, he proposed, not with cameras and fanfare, but during a quiet evening at my modest apartment, surrounded by case files and half-written grant proposals. "Amber, I've never met anyone like you," he said, getting down on one knee. "You're real, you're pure. You make me feel like I matter beyond my last name. Will you marry me?" I said yes, but part of me wondered if I was walking into a trap. Wallace knew Amber the humanitarian, the woman who asked for nothing and gave everything. But he didn't know who I'd been before I became that person, or whose empire I'd been chosen to inherit. I stood in the center of that lavish garden, my once perfect wedding gown, clinging to my trembling shoulders not from fear, but from betrayal. The marble fountain behind me whispered promises the Harmon family never intended to keep. Crystal chandeliers dangled from silk tents like frozen tears, and every eye in that garden was on me, the charity case who'd somehow tricked their golden boy into proposing. "Take a good look at her," Nellie Harmon spat, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his eyes glinting with the kind of cruelty only the insecure possess. He circled me like a predator who'd finally cornered wounded prey. Kelly, his younger mirror image, smirked from across the aisle. "She's probably here for the family money, Wallace. You think she'd still love you if you weren't the Harmon heir, if your last name was Smith and you drove a Honda? The guests whispered, cameras clicked. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped, but nobody moved to stop them. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, to tell them that I'd loved Wallace for his gentleness, for the way he saw me as more than a transaction. But my voice felt trapped behind a wall of humiliation so thick I could barely breathe. Enough, I finally said, my voice trembling but steady enough to cut through their mockery. You don't know me. Oh, we know exactly what you are, Kelly snarled, stepping closer until I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with contempt. A gold digger who can't even afford her own shoes. Did you borrow that dress too, sweetheart? Or did Wallace pay for it like everything else in your sad little life? Laughter rippled through the crowd like poison. The chandelier lights reflected off the tears pooling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not for them. I turned to Wallace, my groom, the man who'd promised to stand beside me through everything, and found him frozen. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between his brothers and me like a man watching two trains about to collide. "Wallace," I whispered, "say something." But he didn't. He just stood there, drowning in the expectations of a family that measured worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. Nellie shoved him forward. "Say something," he barked. "Defend your little charity case, brother, or admit you made a mistake marrying beneath you." Wallace opened his mouth. And then the world exploded. The sound of shattering glass tore through the courtyard like a gunshot. Screams erupted. Men in black tactical gear stormed through the garden gates, weapons drawn, boots crushing white rose petals into the wet grass. "Everyone down! This is a raid. Hands where we can see them." Guests dove for cover. Women in designer gowns hit the ground. The wedding cake toppled, frosting splattering across marble like spilled blood. Chaos consumed everything, the fairy tale dissolving into a nightmare in seconds. I dropped to my knees instinctively, but not out of fear. Out of training. Old instincts I'd buried deep, the kind I thought I'd never need again, roared to life like a sleeping dragon. My heart slowed. My breathing steadied. My mind sharpened into focus. Two guards lunged toward me, mistaking me for just another helpless bride. The first never made it close. I caught his wrist mid-reach, twisted hard, and sent his weapon skittering across the wet stone. He gasped, stumbling backward, clutching his arm. The second tried to grab my veil. I pivoted, drove my heel into his knee, and he crumpled with a sharp crack that echoed above the chaos. The garden fell into stunned silence. Even the storm clouds above seemed to pause, waiting. "What the hell?" Nellie's voice broke through the shock, trembling now instead of cruel. "Who is she?" The lead attacker, a tall man with a tactical vest and a scar across his jaw, froze mid-command. His eyes locked onto mine, and I watched realization dawn across his face like sunrise breaking through fog. "Ma'am." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Miss Chase?" I turned sharply, my torn wedding gown billowing around me like battle armor. "Stand down." He immediately dropped his weapon and motioned for his team to do the same. Within seconds, what had looked like a violent raid transformed into something else entirely: coordinated obedience. The armed men stood at attention as stunned guests looked on, mouths open, phones recording everything. From somewhere behind them, a voice called out, calm, controlled, and unmistakable. "Allow me." Attorney Rui Van Golf stepped through the wreckage like a shadow-given form. His dark suit was immaculate despite the debris, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding in a way that made even Nellie shrink back. He held a sealed document high for everyone to see. "I am Attorney Rui Van Golf of Van Golf and Associates," he announced, his voice cutting through the rain, soaked air like a blade. "Executor of the late Sir Isaac Necroff's estate." Nellie scoffed, but his voice cracked. "What does that have to do with everything?" Rui interrupted, his gaze cold enough to freeze fire. "Because as of this morning, Sir Isaac's $950 million conglomerate has been transferred to his sole beneficiary, Miss Amber Chase." The words hit like thunder. Kelly's mouth fell open. Wallace turned ghost white. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs that grew louder and louder until they became a roar. Rui continued calmly, unfolding the document with surgical precision. Sir Isaac named Miss Chase as his successor and primary heir 1 year ago. The inheritance transfer was triggered today upon her marriage to Wallace Harmon. One of the security men held up a sign that confirmed it. Inheritance transfer, 950 metro. I stood silently in the center of it all, my breath steady, my torn dress clinging to me like proof of survival. Every eye was on me now, the woman they'd called a gold digger, the woman they'd humiliated minutes before, the woman who'd just inherited an empire. Nellie stumbled forward, disbelief twisting his face into something almost unrecognizable. "You're lying. Isaac wouldn't, he barely knew her." Rui turned to him, unflinching. "Sir Isaac didn't barely know her. He trusted her more than any of you. She worked beside him for 4 years under a private identity, running the community projects he funded. He saw her intelligence, her integrity, her character, and he chose her as his heir." Kelly's voice cracked. "This can't be real." I met their eyes, calm and unreadable. "It's real. I never wanted your family's fortune. I wanted a family who didn't measure worth in numbers." The tension broke with a gasp as Wallace swayed, his eyes rolling back. He fainted, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Cameras flashed. Guests screamed. Rain began to fall in earnest now, washing away the illusion of perfection the Harmon family had spent years building. And through it all, I stood unshaken, surrounded by bodyguards. I'd once trained myself, men who knew exactly who I was, even when I'd been pretending to be someone else. Attorney Rui stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Sir Isaac wanted today to be a lesson. He knew they would try to humiliate you. He wanted the world to see who they really were." I nodded slowly, rain streaming down my face like baptism. Then he got his wish. If you think money doesn't change how people treat you, hit subscribe. Only the fair-minded will understand what happens next. 1 year earlier, I was invisible. That's what I told myself every morning when I tied my hair into a simple bun and slipped into thrift store cardigans that hid more than just my figure. I wanted to disappear into the hum of Chicago's forgotten neighborhoods where people needed help more than they needed to know my name. The Riverside Humanitarian Foundation occupied the second floor of a building wedged between a laundromat and a used bookstore. No marble fountains, no crystal chandeliers. Just flickering fluorescent lights, mismatched filing cabinets, and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered to people who'd never make headlines. I coordinated community projects, rebuilding playgrounds in underfunded neighborhoods, organizing food drives, connecting families with resources the system had abandoned. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And after everything I'd survived, real was all I could trust. What nobody knew, not my coworkers, not the volunteers, not the families I served, was that I'd once lived a completely different life. 4 years before I became Amber Chase, the humanitarian worker, I was Amber Chase, the protégé, Sir Isaac Neckroff's right hand. The woman he trusted to execute million-dollar deals, manage crisis response teams, and see through the masks people wore when money was involved. Isaac didn't just mentor me, he rebuilt me. I'd met him at my lowest point, broke, disillusioned, watching my father's construction company collapse under debt and my mother's medical bills pile up like tombstones. Isaac found me working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, refusing to quit even when quitting made sense. "You don't break under pressure," he'd said during our first meeting, his silver hair catching the light like wisdom made visible. "You sharpen, that's rare." He hired me as his assistant, but within months, I was managing operations most executives couldn't handle. He taught me how empires were built, not through cruelty, but through clarity. Not through greed, but through strategic generosity. "Power isn't about what you take, Amber," he'd said during one late-night strategy session. "It's about what you build that outlasts you." But Isaac also taught me something darker. Wealth attracts wolves. His own family proved it. Distant relatives appeared whenever his health declined, circling like vultures with lawyers and forged documents. Business partners who'd smiled at galas tried to sabotage acquisitions. Even employees he'd trusted for decades betrayed him when the price was right. "Trust no one," he'd told me 6 months before he died, his voice weakened by illness but his mind still sharp as broken glass. "Except Rui. He's the only one who's never wanted anything from me but the truth. Attorney Rui Van Golf became the executor of Isaac's estate and my only connection to the life I'd left behind. When Isaac passed, I inherited nothing publicly by design. He wanted me to choose my own path, free from the weight of his name. So I walked away from luxury, from power, from everything that made me a target. I moved into a tiny apartment above a Chicago diner and started over as someone ordinary, someone safe, someone who could finally breathe without wondering who was watching. That worked perfectly until October 15th, when Wallace Harmon walked into the Foundation's annual gala. He wasn't supposed to be there. The Harmon family donated to dozens of charities, but they never attended events. They just signed checks and claimed tax deductions. But Wallace showed up that night, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit, like a man who'd wandered into the wrong party. "Excuse me," he'd said, approaching me while I arranged donation table displays. "I'm looking for Amber Chase. I'm told she runs this place." I straightened, brushing dust from my bargain dress. "That's me. Can I help you?" He blinked, clearly expecting someone different. "I'm Wallace Harmon. My family supports this foundation, and I wanted to see the work firsthand instead of just reading reports." That surprised me. Wealthy donors rarely cared about impact, they cared about optics. But Wallace listened as I explained our programs. He asked thoughtful questions about the families we served, the systemic barriers we fought against, the dreams we protected with grants nobody else would approve. He didn't check his phone once, didn't name drop, didn't treat me like staff. He treated me like someone worth knowing. "Would you maybe want to get coffee?" he asked as the gala ended. "Not as a donor, just as someone who'd like to understand this work better, and maybe understand you too." I should have said no, should have recognized the danger of letting someone from that world get close. But something in his eyes looked genuine, vulnerable even, like he was tired of people wanting him for his last name instead of his actual self. "Sure," I heard myself say. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became long walks through Grant Park. Walks became Sunday mornings where he'd show up with pastries while I organized donation drives, rolling up his expensive sleeves to help pack boxes. He told me he felt trapped by expectations, his family's legacy, his predetermined future, the weight of being the heir. I told him about my passion for invisible work, for helping people the world forgot. What I didn't tell him was that I'd once managed the very empire his family envied, that Isaac Necroff had chosen me as his successor before anyone knew what that meant, that I was hiding not from poverty, but from power I wasn't ready to claim. 4 months later, Wallace proposed in my cramped apartment, surrounded by case files and grant proposals. "You're real, Amber," he'd said, kneeling on my worn carpet. "You make me feel like I matter beyond my bank account. Will you marry me?" I said yes, even though warning bells screamed in my mind. Even though I knew his family would see me as a threat, even though Isaac's voice echoed in my memory, the unworthy always reveal themselves when they think you're powerless. Now, sitting in that apartment, I stared at my engagement ring, a modest diamond Wallace had chosen himself, refusing his mother's family heirlooms, and whispered to the empty room, "You have no idea who you're marrying, Wallace." But part of me hoped he'd love me anyway when he finally found out. The Harmon estate smelled like old money and fresh judgment. I stood at the entrance of their dining room, my modest dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Crystal chandeliers cast cold light across a table set for warfare 12-place settings, each piece of silverware positioned with military precision, each wine glass reflecting my nervous face back at me like a warning. Wallace squeezed my hand. "They're going to love you," he whispered, but his palm was sweating. He was lying to both of us. Nellie entered first, his tailored suit sharp enough to cut. He looked me up and down like I was livestock at auction, his expression settling somewhere between amusement and disgust. "So this is the foundation, girl," he said, not offering his hand. "Wallace has told us so much about your charitable work." The pause before charitable lasted just long enough to strip the word of any warmth. Kelly followed, younger but equally venomous, carrying a wine bottle that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Amber, was it? That's such a simple name." I love how unpretentious it is. Translation, cheap. Their mother, Margaret Harmon, glided in wearing pearls that could have funded 3 community centers. Her smile was porcelain, beautiful, fragile, and completely lifeless. "Welcome, dear," she said, air-kissing near my cheeks without making contact. "Please sit. I'm sure you must be overwhelmed by all this. Wallace tells me you're not accustomed to formal dinners." I wasn't, but I'd once dined with oil executives and tech moguls at Isaac's table, negotiating deals while they underestimated me. The Harmons had money, but Isaac had taught me something more valuable: how to recognize people who confuse wealth with worth. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Harmon," I said evenly, taking my seat. The dinner began like a performance, servers appearing silently, courses arriving in choreographed intervals, conversation flowing like rehearsed lines. But the script was designed to make me stumble. "So, Amber," Margaret began, delicately cutting her salmon, "Wallace mentioned you studied at a state school. How practical. Did you enjoy the large class sizes?" Nellie smirked into his wine. "I heard some state schools have classes with 300 students. Must be hard to get individual attention from professors who are just there for research grants." "I learned what I needed," I replied calmly. "Education isn't about the size of the classroom, it's about what you do with what you learn." Kelly laughed sharp, cruel. "That's adorable, very bootstraps mentality. But let's be honest, connections matter more than philosophy, don't they? I mean, where would you be without meeting Wallace?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. "Nowhere." Wallace shifted uncomfortably. "Kelly, that's not—" "It's fine," I interrupted gently, though my grip tightened on my fork. "You're right, that meeting Wallace changed my life, but I'd like to think I've brought something to his life too." Margaret's smile thinned. "Of course, dear, love is so important, though in families like ours, there are also practical considerations. Legacies to protect, reputations to maintain. Which is why," Nellie said, leaning forward like a prosecutor closing in, "we've prepared a prenuptial agreement. Standard procedure, protects everyone involved." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. "I see." Kelly poured himself more wine, his words loosening. "Nothing personal, Amber. It's just that when you're marrying into wealth you didn't build, people need assurances. The prenup basically says you leave with what you came with, which, let's be honest, isn't much to worry about." He said it like a joke, like my entire existence was a punchline. Wallace cleared his throat. "We can discuss this later." "Actually," Margaret interrupted smoothly, "I think it's best to be transparent now. Amber strikes me as a practical woman. Surely she understands that protecting family assets is simply good business." My phone buzzed in my purse, a lifeline disguised as an interruption. "Excuse me," I said, standing. "I need to take this." I walked to the hallway, my heels clicking against marble that probably cost more than my entire education. My hands trembled as I answered. "Amber." Rui's voice was steady, grounding. "How's dinner?" "Exactly like you warned me it would be," I whispered. "Remember what Isaac told you?" Rui said quietly. "The unworthy always reveal themselves. They can't help it. It's in their nature to expose who they are when they think you're powerless. They want me to sign a prenup that strips me of everything." "Of course they do. They see you as a threat disguised as a charity case. Let them think they're winning, Amber. Isaac's plan doesn't activate until the wedding. Until then, you're just the foundation girl they can control." I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. "And if Wallace sides with them?" Rui paused. "Then you'll know exactly who he is before you're legally bound to him. Either way, truth reveals itself." I hung up and stood in that hallway for a moment, staring at oil paintings of Harmon ancestors who probably treated people like me as servants. Then I heard voices drifting from the dining room, Wallace and his brothers, speaking in hushed tones they thought I couldn't hear. "She's going to sign it, right?" Kelly's voice. "I don't know," Wallace said, and my heart cracked at his uncertainty. "She might be offended." "Then make her understand," Nellie snapped. "This isn't about love, Wallace. This is about protecting what's ours. Dad built this family's reputation over decades. We're not letting some girl from nowhere put that at risk." Silence. Then Wallace's voice, quieter now. "You're right. I'll talk to her. We'll protect the family's interests." The words hit like ice water. I pressed my hand against the wall, steadying myself. Isaac's voice echoed in my memory. Love is beautiful, Amber, but watch what people choose when they have to pick between loving you and protecting themselves. Wallace had just made his choice. I walked back into the dining room, my smile perfectly composed, my decision already made. I would play their game, sign their prenup, let them think they'd won. Because in a few months, when Attorney Rui read Isaac's will at my wedding, they'd learn what I already knew. You can't strip someone of power they haven't claimed yet. And I was about to claim everything. Sorry about that, I said, reclaiming my seat. Now, about that prenup, I'd be happy to review it. Margaret's smile widened, victorious. Wallace looked relieved, guilty, and I looked like exactly what they thought I was, a woman with nothing to lose. They had no idea how wrong they were. I woke to sunlight streaming through my apartment window and the taste of doubt in my mouth. Today, I would become Mrs. Wallace Harmon. Today, everything would change, though not in the way anyone expected. My wedding dress hung on the closet door, white silk catching the morning light like hope made tangible. I'd chosen something simple, elegant, refusing the designer gowns Margaret had pushed on me. This dress was mine, paid for with money I'd earned, not borrowed or gifted or used as another way to make me feel small. I touched the fabric and felt my hands tremble. Was I making a mistake? Wallace had stood silent at that dinner. He'd agreed to protect the family's interests, like I was something that needed protecting against. But he'd also shown up at my foundation every Sunday. He'd held my hand through thunderstorms and told me I made him feel human. Which version of Wallace would meet me at the altar? My phone rang. Rui. "Good morning, bride," he said, and I could hear the careful neutrality in his tone, the voice of a man preparing for battle while hoping for peace. "Morning," I managed. "Are you already at the estate?" "I've been here since dawn. Security is extensive." A pause. "Amber, do you have the sealed letter Isaac left you?" My eyes drifted to my dresser drawer. The envelope sat there, thick cream paper with Isaac's handwriting across the front. To Amber, "Open only if you need to remember who you are." I'd never opened it, never needed to. The weight of Isaac's belief in me had always been enough. "I have it," I said. "Bring it with you," Rui instructed. "Tuck it inside your bouquet or somewhere close, just in case." In case of what? Silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. "In case you need to remember," he finally said. "Isaac knew this day would test you. He wanted you to have his words if things became difficult." My throat tightened. "Rui, do you think I'm making a mistake?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you're about to find out exactly who loves you and who loves the idea of controlling you. Either way, you won't be powerless." Isaac made sure of that. He hung up before I could ask what he meant. The Neckroff estate was chaos disguised as celebration. Reporters crowded the gates, cameras flashing like predatory eyes. Guests arrived in luxury cars, their designer outfits color-coordinated with the garden arrangements. Everything was perfect, polished performance, a fairy tale constructed for people who'd never believed someone like me deserved one. I arrived through the back entrance, my small bridal party flanking me like armor. But even here, in the private corridors, I felt the weight of judgment pressing down. Nellie found me near the dressing room, his tuxedo already wrinkled, his eyes cold. "Big day," he said, leaning against the doorframe like he owned even the air I breathed. "You ready to officially become a Harmon? Though I suppose you've already won, haven't you?" Locked down the air without even trying. I adjusted my veil, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my fear. "I'm marrying Wallace because I love him." "Sure you are." He smirked, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just remember, don't stain the aisle when you cry, sweetheart. Tears are so pedestrian at weddings, especially for brides who are just happy they're finally getting paid." He walked away before I could respond, his laughter echoing down the marble hallway. My hands shook as I opened my bouquet white roses and baby's breath, simple and pure, and tucked Isaac's letter deep inside, where no one would see it but I could feel its presence. "Remember who you are," Isaac had written. Today, I would need that reminder. Through the window, I watched Wallace pacing in the garden, his brothers flanking him like guards. They were talking, arguing, actually their gestures sharp, their faces tense. Wallace kept running his hands through his hair, a tell I'd learned meant he was overwhelmed. Nellie grabbed his shoulder. Kelly pointed toward the mansion. Wallace nodded, his expression crumbling into something that looked like resignation. They were pressuring him. Even now, minutes before our vows, I pressed my hand against the glass, wanting to go to him, to remind him why we'd chosen this. But something stopped me, a shadow moving past the perimeter fence. Black vans. 3 of them, parked just beyond the estate gates, windows tinted dark enough to hide whatever was inside. Security, probably. The Harmons would have hired extra protection for an event this public. But something about those vans felt deliberate, positioned, waiting. I turned away from the window as my coordinator knocked. "Miss Chase, it's time. Time to walk down that aisle. Time to face the family that wanted me gone. Time to marry a man who I hoped would choose me over his brothers, even though history suggested otherwise." I picked up my bouquet, feeling Isaac's letter pulse against my palm like a heartbeat. "Remember who you are." I was Amber Chase, Isaac Necroff's chosen heir, a woman who'd survived worse than whispers and prenups and cruel brothers. And if today went wrong, if Wallace stood silent again, if the Harmons humiliated me, if love proved weaker than legacy, I would survive that too. Because storms don't break every woman. Some of us become the storm. I opened the door and walked toward my wedding, carrying Isaac's final words like a weapon I prayed I wouldn't need to use. The aisle stretched before me like a battlefield disguised as a dream. White rose petals scattered across marble, string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon. 300 guests in designer suits and silk dresses, their phones already raised, ready to capture the fairy tale for social media proof that love conquers all. But fairy tales don't account for wolves dressed as family. Wallace stood at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, his face pale but hopeful. Behind him, Nellie and Kelly flanked like sentries guarding territory they'd never let me claim. I began my walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, Isaac's letter pressing against my palm through the bouquet, my heart beating a rhythm that sounded like warning, warning, warning. The officiant smiled. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Wet. Nellie's voice cut through the ceremony like a knife through silk. The music stopped. Guests gasped. Wallace's eyes widened in horror. "I'm sorry," Nellie said, stepping forward, his voice dripping with false concern. "But I can't let this continue without addressing something that's come to my attention. Something Wallace deserves to know before he makes a terrible mistake." Margaret Harmon stood from her seat, her hand fluttering to her pearls. "Nellie, this isn't—" "It's necessary, Mother." He turned to face the crowd, a prosecutor addressing a jury. "How well do any of us really know Amber Chase?" My breath caught. This wasn't part of any script I'd imagined. Kelly produced a folder from inside his jacket, too prepared, too rehearsed. We ran a background check, standard procedure for anyone marrying into our family, and what we found was disturbing. He opened the folder, holding up papers for everyone to see. "Amber has over $47,000 in personal debt, credit cards maxed out, student loans in default, collection agencies calling." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wildfire. "That's not—" I started, but my voice cracked. "Not what?" Kelly interrupted. "Not true? Then explain these documents. Explain why a woman drowning in debt suddenly wants to marry into one of Chicago's wealthiest families." Cameras clicked, phones recorded. I could feel the narrative being written in real time. Gold digger exposed at altar. Wallace turned to me, confusion and hurt warring across his face. "Amber, is this real?" "No," I whispered, my hands trembling around my bouquet. "Those aren't my accounts. I don't have that kind of debt." "Of course you'd deny it," Nellie said smoothly. "But what about your father?" My blood turned to ice. "Tell us, Amber," Kelly continued, circling me now like a predator who'd cornered wounded prey. "Tell everyone about your father's criminal record, about the fraud conviction, about the time he served in federal prison." The lie was so audacious, so calculated, I almost laughed. "My father died when I was 17, I said quietly, my voice shaking but clear. "He was a construction worker. He never committed fraud. He never went to prison." "Then explain this arrest record." Kelly held up another document, fabricated but convincing enough to make guests whisper. "She's lying," someone in the crowd said. "I knew something was off about her," another voice added. The humiliation built like a wave preparing to crash. Wallace stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came. No defense, no protection. He was drowning in his family's expectations, and I was the anchor they wanted him to cut loose. "Wallace," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "You know me. You know this isn't true." He looked at his brothers, then at me, then at the 300 guests recording his every move. I don't know what to believe. The words shattered something inside me. Nellie moved closer, his voice low but loud enough for the front rows to hear. "This is what happens when you let charity cases into your life, brother. They take and take until there's nothing left." "She doesn't even belong here," Kelly added, gesturing at my dress with disgust. "Look at her, playing dress-up in a world she'll never understand." He reached out, whether to grab my arm or gesture. I wasn't sure, but his hand caught my veil. The delicate fabric tore with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire garden. Gasps. More cameras. My veil hung in tatters, my dress torn at the shoulder, my carefully constructed composure crumbling under the weight of 300 pairs of judging eyes. Tears streamed down my face, hot and unstoppable. This was it. The moment they'd orchestrated, the public execution disguised as family protection. But then I heard Isaac's voice in my memory, steady as a heartbeat. "The unworthy always reveal themselves, Amber. Let them. Their cruelty is the proof you'll need." I took a breath. Then another. My hands steadied around my bouquet, Isaac's letter pulsing against my palm like a promise kept. I looked at Nellie, then Kelly, then Wallace, the man who'd claimed to love me but couldn't defend me when it mattered most. And I whispered to myself, just loud enough for the microphone to catch, "Isaac said it would happen. Let them finish." Confusion flickered across Nellie's face. "What did you just—" The sound of shattering glass exploded through the courtyard. Then came the screams. Men in black tactical gear stormed through the garden gates, weapons drawn, boots crushing white rose petals into the wet grass, their synchronized movements turning the wedding into a war zone in seconds. "Everyone down, this is a raid." Guests dove for cover. The wedding cake toppled. Chaos consumed everything, the fairy tale dissolving into nightmare, the humiliation interrupted by something far more terrifying. Or so they thought. I dropped to my knees, but not out of fear, out of training. Because the storm they'd tried to break me with was about to reveal exactly who I was and what I'd been hiding all along. The unworthy had revealed themselves. Now it was my turn. Chaos is just order waiting to be recognized. Isaac taught me that during my first crisis management training, while guests screamed and dove beneath tables, while reporters scrambled for exits and bridesmaids clutched each other in terror, I stayed perfectly still, watching, calculating, waiting. The armed men moved with precision, not random violence, coordinated strategy. 2 guards rushed toward me, assuming I was just another panicked bride who needed protecting, or controlling. They assumed wrong. The first one reached for my arm. I caught his wrist mid-grab, twisted hard using his own momentum against him, and sent him sprawling into the fountain. Water exploded upward, drenching the rose arrangements. The second guard tried to recover his partner's weapon. I pivoted, drove my heel into his knee with enough force to make him buckle, then swept his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, gasping. The garden fell into stunned silence. Even the tactical team froze, weapons half raised, staring at the bride in the torn wedding gown who just neutralized 2 trained security personnel in under 5 seconds. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, I need to know, are you waiting to see if I get my revenge? Or do you just enjoy watching people suffer? Either way, hit that subscribe button. And if you won't, tell me why in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what's stopping you. Margaret Harmon's voice broke through the shock, shrill and panicked. "What is happening? Someone call the police." "Ma'am, we are the police," one of the armed men started, but his voice faltered when he looked at me, really looked at me. His weapon lowered, his eyes widened. Miss Chase?" he stammered, his voice shifting from authority to something closer to reverence. I stood slowly, my torn veil hanging around my shoulders like battle scars, my breathing steady despite my racing heart. "Stand down, Marcus." "Yes, ma'am." He immediately signaled to his team. "Lower your weapons, stand down." Within seconds, what looked like a violent raid transformed into something else entirely. The armed men stood at attention, weapons holstered, posture rigid with respect. Guests who'd been cowering now rose slowly, phones recording, confusion replacing terror. "I don't understand," Wallace whispered, his face ghost white. "Amber, who are you?" Before I could answer, footsteps echoed across the marble, slow, deliberate, theatrical. Attorney Rui Van Golf emerged through the chaos like a shadow given purpose. His dark suit was immaculate despite the wreckage, his expression unreadable, a sealed document held high for everyone to see. The storm clouds above seemed to pause, waiting for his words. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rui announced, his voice carrying across the garden with courtroom precision. "I apologize for the dramatic interruption, but given the events of the past 10 minutes, certain legal matters can no longer remain private." Nellie found his voice, though it cracked. "What legal matters? Who the hell are you?" "I am Attorney Rui Van Golf of Van Golf and Associates." He moved to stand beside me, his presence solid and protective. "Executor of the late Sir Isaac Neckroff's estate." The name hit like lightning. Isaac Neckroff, Chicago's philanthropist titan, the man who'd built a $950 million empire before his death 2 years ago, an empire whose heir had remained mysteriously anonymous. Until now. "What does Isaac Neckroff have to do with this wedding?" Kelly demanded, but his voice wavered. Rui unfolded the document with deliberate slowness, letting anticipation build. "Everything. Because as of this morning, at precisely 10:47 a.m., Sir Isaac's entire conglomerate Neckroff Holdings, its subsidiaries, properties, investments, and liquid assets totaling $950 million, has been transferred to his sole designated heir." He turned to face me, and for the first time since the chaos began, I felt tears return not from humiliation, but from the weight of Isaac's faith in me finally being revealed. "Miss Amber Chase." The words detonated across the garden like a bomb. Gasps, screams, phones capturing every second. Margaret collapsed into her chair. Kelly's mouth fell open, working soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. And Nellie, who'd called me a gold digger, who'd torn my veil, who'd fabricated lies about my father, stumbled backward like he'd been struck. "You're lying," he managed. "Isaac wouldn't, he barely knew her. This is some kind of fraud." "Sir Isaac knew Miss Chase better than anyone in this garden," Rui interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through denial. "She worked beside him for 4 years as his private assistant and strategic advisor, operating under a protected identity. He witnessed her intelligence, her integrity, her character qualities your family demonstrated you sorely lack." Rui held up another document, this one bearing official seals. 1 year ago, Sir Isaac amended his will with explicit instructions. His inheritance would transfer to Miss Chase upon her marriage, ensuring she would have both love and security. He knew Rui's gaze swept across the Harmon family like judgment itself, that those who truly valued her would reveal themselves, as would those who saw her as an obstacle to their own greed. "The security team you see before you?" Rui gestured to the armed men. "These are Miss Chase's personal protection detail, men she trained herself during her years managing crisis response operations for Neckroff Holdings. This raid was a controlled operation designed to activate in case of emergency which, given your family's behavior, proved necessary." Kelly's voice cracked. "This can't be real. This is insane." "What's insane?" I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since the chaos began, "is that you spent months making me feel worthless, making me question if love was enough, making me believe I had to earn the right to exist in your world." I looked at Wallace, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "I never wanted your family's money, Wallace. I wanted a family who measured worth by character, not bank accounts. I wanted someone who would choose me when it mattered." His knees buckled. He swayed once, twice, then fainted, hitting the ground with a dull thud that would have been comical if it wasn't so pathetic. Rui didn't even glance at him. He raised his voice, addressing the entire garden. "By order of Sir Isaac Neckroff's last testament, executed this day and witnessed by the state of Illinois, I hereby declare Miss Amber Chase the rightful owner and chairwoman of Neckroff Holdings." He handed me the document, heavy, official, real. "The empire is yours, Miss Chase, as it always should have been." I stood there in my torn wedding gown, surrounded by bodyguards I'd trained, holding proof of an inheritance that made me wealthier than everyone who'd humiliated me combined. And I felt nothing but the ghost of Isaac's voice whispering, "Truth reveals itself when the unworthy speak." They'd spoken. Now the truth stood before them in a torn white dress, holding $950 million, and the knowledge that they'd never truly known her at all. The video went viral in 17 minutes. Not the romantic highlight reel every bride dreams of. The other kind. The kind that destroys reputations before lawyers can draft statements. Number: Harmon Brothers exposed. Number: wedding justice. Number: gold digger revealed. Except this time, the Harmons were the gold diggers. By evening, the footage had been viewed 47 million times. Nellie tearing Amber's veil, Kelly's cruel laughter, Wallace's frozen silence when his bride needed him most. Then the twist no one saw coming: the security team standing at attention for the nobody in the wedding gown. The comments section became a public execution. Imagine bullying someone at their own wedding and finding out they're worth $1 billion. Wallace fainting is the most pathetic thing I've ever seen. She dodged a bullet. The way she disarmed those guards, who is she? News outlets picked it up within the hour. CNN, BBC. Local Chicago stations camped outside the Neckroff estate. Cameras trained on windows like hunters waiting for prey. Rui handled them with surgical precision, his statement released before the Harmons could spin their narrative. Miss Amber Chase, CEO and chairwoman of Neckroff Holdings, was subjected to coordinated harassment by the Harmon family during what should have been a private ceremony. The inheritance reveal was executed per Sir Isaac Neckroff's explicit instructions to protect Miss Chase from exploitation. No further comment at this time. Short, devastating, true. The Harmons released their own statement 3 hours later, a rambling defense about misunderstandings and family concerns that only made them look worse. Margaret claimed they were protecting Wallace from a stranger. Nellie insisted the debt documents were legitimate concerns, not fabrications. The internet tore them apart. Within 24 hours, the Harmon family became case studies in cruelty. Their country club memberships were under review. Business partners distanced themselves. Charity boards quietly removed their names. Karma delivered through Wi-Fi. I watched it all from Isaac's my penthouse office on the 42nd floor of Neckroff Tower. The city sprawled beneath me, Chicago's skyline glittering like scattered diamonds against the night. This office had once felt like visiting a museum somewhere I belonged but didn't own. Now the nameplate on the door read Amber Chase, Chairwoman and CEO. The weight of it should have crushed me. Instead, I felt strangely hollow. Rui entered without knocking, carrying tea I hadn't asked for but desperately needed. "Wallace is downstairs," he said quietly. "Security is holding him in the lobby. He's been there for 3 hours." I didn't look away from the window. What does he want? To apologize, to explain, to beg forgiveness. Rui set the tea on my desk. He's called 17 times, left 12 voicemails. One of them was 8 minutes of crying. And the others? Promises he'll do better, that he loves you, that he was weak but he's ready to fight for you now. Rui's tone suggested exactly what he thought of those promises. "He says he can't live without you." "Funny," I whispered. He seemed to live just fine without defending me. Silence stretched between us. Outside, a helicopter circled more press, probably trying to catch footage of the heiress in her tower. "Do you want to see him?" Rui asked. I thought about it. About Wallace's warm brown eyes and Sunday morning coffee runs. About the way he'd held my hand during thunderstorms and told me I made him feel human. Then I thought about him standing frozen at that altar while his brothers destroyed me. "No," I said. "Tell him I don't owe him my peace." Rui nodded, unsurprised. "I'll handle it." "And Rui?" I turned to face him. "Thank you for everything, for being exactly who Isaac said you were." His expression softened barely, but enough. "Isaac knew you'd need someone in your corner who couldn't be bought or intimidated. I was honored to be that person then. I'm honored now." He left, closing the door with a soft click that felt like finality. I walked to the far wall where Isaac's portrait hung oil on canvas, his silver hair catching light, his eyes holding that particular wisdom that comes from building empires and surviving betrayal. Memories flooded back unbidden. Isaac teaching me to read balance sheets at midnight, his patience infinite when I asked questions 3 times. The numbers tell stories, Amber. Learn to hear what they're really saying. Isaac handing me control of a $10 million project when I was only 24, betting on my competence when no one else would. Confidence isn't loud. It's quiet certainty that you can handle whatever comes. Isaac on his deathbed, weak but determined, gripping my hand. They'll underestimate you because you're young, because you're kind, because you don't perform power, you simply have it. Let them. The unworthy always reveal themselves when they think you're powerless. And when they do, you'll know exactly who deserves your trust. Tears slid down my cheeks not from grief, but from gratitude. He'd prepared me for this. Every late-night lesson, every trust exercise, every warning about people who measure worth in dollars instead of character. He'd known the Harmons would show their true nature. He'd orchestrated the inheritance reveal not as revenge, but as protection, ensuring I'd have undeniable proof of my value when they tried to strip it away. You were right, I whispered to his portrait, my voice breaking. Truth reveals itself when the unworthy speak. And they had spoken. Loudly. On camera. In front of 300 witnesses and 47 million viewers. Now the world knew what Isaac had always known, that worth isn't inherited through blood or bought with cruelty. It's earned through character, through integrity, through choosing kindness even when the world rewards brutality. I touched the frame of his portrait, feeling the weight of his empire, my empire now settling across my shoulders like a crown I'd never asked for but would wear with honor. I won't let you down, I promised. Outside, the city glittered. Below, Wallace probably still sat in the lobby, waiting for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. And, in my reflection against the dark window, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. A woman who knew exactly who she was. Not Wallace's almost wife, not the Harmon's victim, not the Foundation worker playing small to stay safe. Amber Chase, Isaac Neckroff's chosen heir, CEO of a $950 million empire. A woman who'd walked through fire in a torn wedding gown and emerged holding proof that storms don't break everyone. Some of us become the storm, and my forecast was just beginning. I returned to the Neckroff estate on a Wednesday. Not with fanfare or cameras, just me, Rui, and the quiet certainty that closure requires confrontation. The mansion looked smaller somehow, or maybe I'd just grown larger. The gardens where I'd been humiliated still held traces of that day, trampled rose petals ground into marble, crushed wedding cake remnants staining the fountain's edge. The chandelier tent had been removed, leaving only brass hooks that caught afternoon light like questions waiting to be answered. The Harmon family waited in the formal sitting room, the same one where Margaret had served me passive-aggressive politeness over dinner, but everything had changed. Margaret's pearls were gone. Nellie's suit looked rumpled, off the rack instead of tailored. Kelly couldn't meet my eyes. And Wallace looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 days. Miss Chase, Margaret began, her voice stripped of its usual authority. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I didn't sit. Standing gave me the advantage Isaac had taught me to always claim. This isn't a negotiation, I said quietly. I'm here to deliver a message and settle accounts. Nellie shifted uncomfortably. Look, we may have been hasty in our judgment, but surely we can come to some arrangement. An arrangement? I let the word hang in the air like smoke. You fabricated evidence. You publicly humiliated me. You tore my wedding dress and called me a gold digger in front of 300 witnesses. We were protecting Wallace, Margaret tried, but her voice cracked. You were protecting your control over him, I corrected. There's a difference. I pulled out a folder Rui had prepared: termination notices, eviction papers, account closures, legal documents that carried the weight of consequence. As of today, your board positions at Neckroff Holdings are terminated. Your access to family trust funds, which, for the record, came from Isaac's generosity, not your own merit, has been revoked. You have 24 hours to vacate this estate. Kelly's face went pale. "You can't just throw us out." "I can, and I am." I met his eyes until he looked away. "But I'm not heartless. You'll each receive a severance package enough to start over, if you're willing to work for it. More than you gave me when you tried to destroy my reputation with lies." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Before you go," I continued, "I want you to meet some people." I nodded to Rui, who opened the door. 7 staff members entered, faces I recognized from files Isaac had kept. The housekeepers, gardeners, and kitchen staff the Harmons had fired over the years for minor infractions or simply to cut costs. "These people served your family for decades," I said. "You discarded them without pension or reference. As of today, they're all reinstated with full back pay and benefits." Margaret's hand fluttered to where her pearls used to be. "You can't afford—" "I can afford anything," I interrupted gently. "That's what $950 million means. But more importantly, I choose to invest in people who've earned it through loyalty and hard work, something your family never understood." The staff members stood taller, and I saw something in their eyes Isaac had taught me to value: dignified gratitude. Wallace finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Amber, can we please talk? Privately?" I hesitated, then nodded. We stepped into the hallway, the same corridor where I'd overheard him agreeing to protect the family's interests against me. "I'm sorry," he said, and tears streamed down his face. "I was weak. I was scared. I chose wrong, and I know that now. I love you, Amber. I know I don't deserve another chance, but—" "Wallace." I stopped him with a hand raised, gentle but firm. "I believe you're sorry. I believe you love me, or at least you love the version of me you thought you knew. But love without courage is just words." "I can be braver," he pleaded. "I'll stand up to them. I forgive you," I said, and watched hope flare in his eyes. "But I can't trust you." The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. "Trust is earned through action, not apology," I continued. "You had one moment that mattered, one chance to choose me when it was hard, and you chose silence. I can't build a life on wondering if you'll find your voice next time." He nodded slowly, understanding settling across his features like winter. "What happens now? You figure out who you want to be without your family's expectations suffocating you. And I looked around the mansion that represented everything I'd gained and lost. I built something Isaac would be proud of. I left him there and walked back through the grand hallway, the same path I'd taken in my torn wedding gown just days ago. My heels clicked against marble with steady rhythm, each step an echo of transformation. Then, I wasn't broken. Now, I wasn't just healed. I was reborn. The roses in the garden had already begun to bloom again, their petals bright against dark soil. Some storms destroy everything in their path, but others clear the ground for new growth. I'd been both the storm and what survived it, and Isaac's voice whispered one final time in my memory. "Empires aren't inherited by blood, Amber. They're inherited by character." I'd proven mine. Now it was time to build. 3 months later, spring arrived in Chicago like a promise kept. From my office on the 42nd floor of Necroft Tower, I watched the city transform, trees blooming along Michigan Avenue, the Chicago River reflecting baby blue sky, people shedding winter coats like old identities they no longer needed. I understood the feeling. The desk in front of me held blueprints for the Amber Chase Foundation for Women's Empowerment, a project funded by Isaac's legacy and built on everything he'd taught me about using wealth as a tool for transformation, not just accumulation. Community centers in 12 underserved neighborhoods, I said, spreading the plans across mahogany that still smelled faintly of Isaac's cologne. Job training programs, legal aid for women escaping financial abuse, scholarships for first-generation college students. Rui studied the documents with his characteristic thoroughness, reading not just the words but the intention behind them. "Isaac would be proud," he said finally. "This is exactly the kind of legacy he hoped you'd build." "It's what he taught me," I replied, "that empires matter less than the lives they touch." The foundation would launch next month with a gala, not the superficial charity events I'd once coordinated, but something real. Survivors sharing stories, opportunities being created. A statement that power could be used to lift instead of crush. The Harmon wedding had taught me that lesson in the cruelest way possible. But Isaac had prepared me to learn it. My phone buzzed a news alert. I almost ignored it, then saw the headline. Harmon family files for bankruptcy. Once, prominent Chicago dynasty falls from grace. The article detailed their collapse with almost poetic precision. Without trust fund access, they'd defaulted on loans. Without board positions, they'd lost influence. Without the Neckroff name protecting them, investors had fled. Margaret had moved to a modest townhouse in the suburbs. Kelly was actually working at a marketing firm, starting at entry level despite his business degree. Nellie had left Chicago entirely, reportedly teaching at a community college in Wisconsin. And Wallace had started volunteering at the Riverside Humanitarian Foundation, the same place where we'd met. According to my former co-workers, he showed up every Sunday, helping with donation drives, asking questions about the work, trying to understand the world I'd lived in while he'd been drowning in privilege. I didn't know if it was genuine transformation or performative guilt. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore. "Do you ever think about him?" Rui asked, reading my expression with the perception Isaac had valued in him. I considered the question honestly. Sometimes, but not the way you'd think. I don't miss what we had. I mourn what we could have been if he'd been braver. Bravery is cultivated, not inherited, Rui said. Perhaps he's learning that now. Perhaps. I closed the article, letting Wallace's story fade into background noise. But I'm not waiting around to find out. Rui smiled, rare, genuine, the kind Isaac used to wear when I'd made a decision that proved his faith in me was justified. "Speaking of not waiting, there's something I need to show you." He pulled a sealed envelope from his briefcase, manila and aged, with Isaac's handwriting across the front, to Amber, to be opened 3 months after the inheritance transfer. My heart stuttered. He left another letter? Several, actually. Instructions for specific timelines. Rui handed it to me carefully, like it held explosives. He wanted you to have space to grieve, to adjust, to find your footing before dealing with this. I opened it with trembling fingers. "Dearest Amber, if you're reading this, you've survived the wedding, you've claimed your inheritance, and you've begun to understand why I chose you as my successor. I'm proud of you, not because you're wealthy now, but because you've remained yourself despite the wealth. That's rarer than you know. But there's something you need to understand about my death. I didn't die from heart failure, as the official reports claimed. I was murdered. The brake failure in my car was no accident. I have evidence, emails, financial transfers, security footage proving that someone tampered with my vehicle 2 days before the crash. Someone who stood to gain from my death before I could finalize my will in your favor. I've compiled everything in a secure file that Rui will help you access. Bank accounts linked to offshore holdings. Communications that prove premeditation. Names of people I trusted who betrayed that trust for money. I'm telling you this not for revenge, Amber. Revenge is expensive and hollow. I'm telling you because you deserve truth, and because the person who killed me will likely try to challenge your inheritance once they realize their plan failed. Be careful, be smart, and remember, the most dangerous people are the ones who smile while sharpening knives. Trust Rui. He's known about this since the beginning and has been protecting you in ways you haven't seen. You were never just my heir, Amber. You were my student, my friend, and the daughter I never had. I didn't save you, you saved yourself. I just gave you the tools and the platform to do it. Build something beautiful with this empire. And when the wolves come, because they will show them why I chose you, with all my love and faith, Isaac. The letter slipped from my fingers. Murdered. The word echoed in my mind like a gunshot in an empty room. You knew, I whispered, looking at Rui. All this time you knew someone killed him. Rui's expression was grave. Isaac suspected for weeks before the crash. He told me everything, made me promise to wait until you were strong enough to handle the truth. We've been investigating quietly, very quietly, for 2 years. Who? The question came out raw, desperate. Who killed him? We're close to confirmation, Rui said carefully. The evidence points to someone with financial connections to the Harmon family's previous business ventures. Someone who knew about your relationship with Isaac and saw the inheritance as a threat. My mind raced through possibilities, connections, implications. Are you saying the Harmons Not directly, but the company that manufactured the faulty brake parts, it was partially owned by Harmon Holdings 3 years ago, before they sold their shares. The timing is suspicious. I stood, pacing to the window, my reflection staring back at me against the Chicago skyline. 3 months ago, I'd thought the wedding was my crucible, the moment that would define me. Now I realized it was just the beginning. Isaac hadn't just given me an empire, he'd given me a mission. To finish what he started, to expose those who thought wealth made them untouchable, to prove that justice doesn't always wear a badge, but sometimes wears a torn wedding gown and $950 million in righteous fury. What do we do? I asked. Rui joined me at the window, standing shoulder to shoulder like soldiers surveying a battlefield. We investigate, we gather irrefutable proof, and when the time is right, we ensure that whoever killed Isaac Necroff faces consequences they can't buy their way out of. I thought about Isaac's voice, his lessons, his faith in me. I thought about the wedding where I'd been humiliated and reborn. I thought about Wallace's weakness and the Harmon's cruelty and the staff members whose lives I'd restored. And I thought about how storms don't just destroy or transform. Sometimes they reveal what was hidden all along. Then let's get to work, I said. Through the window, I could see my reflection superimposed over the city, a woman who'd been broken at an altar and rebuilt herself into something stronger. My torn wedding dress had been framed and now hung in my private office, a reminder that survival leaves scars but also creates armor. I turned to Isaac's portrait, the one I'd moved from the penthouse to this office so he could watch me work. "You were right about everything," I whispered. "Truth reveals itself when the unworthy speak. But it also reveals itself when the worthy refuse to stay silent. Some storms never end. They just change hands, and mine was just beginning. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Amber's journey isn't over. There's a killer to catch, an empire to protect, and justice to serve. Don't miss what happens next. Watch these stories next. They're both on the screen.